Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of the Ask Evoke podcast. I'm your host, Scott Johnston, and I'm joined today by Maya Seckinger, coach for Evoke. Maya and I have a lengthy history that what must be 12 or 13 years of working together. And yeah, Maya was one of the original guinea pigs for a lot of the training methods that we've developed and used over the years, and she's still alive. She lived through all that. Um, and she was also has the distinction in our previous business, Uphill Athlete. Maya was employee number one at that thing, what, 10 years ago or so, something like that. So
Nine, yeah.
she's been around a while. Um, so what we're gonna do today is finish up all the questions we got for the April podcast that Leif and I did a few weeks ago, because we had so many questions and there were some really good ones that needed in-depth answers. And as a consequence, we needed more time. And so we just stopped and I figured we'd start again here with Maya. So let's dive in, Maya. First one. You want to read this one
Okay,
off to me?
sure. Thanks for having me. I'm do my best to be Leif. He's busy climbing right now. Okay, so our first question is I had the following question, which would help. I interpreted the drift test in the following way. I hike at a particular speed of 1.8 mile per hour and 22 degrees for 20 minutes. At the end of the warm up, I look at my heart rate and it's typically stabilized around 130 BPM. I then do two 30-minute segments and capture the heart rate average for each. Recently, they were 132 and 137. So I interpret my heart rate drift to be around 3.79%, which is the percentage increase from 132 to 137. However, this is my question. How close should the heart rate at the end of the warm up be to that heart rate average of the first segment of the drift test? Should we use the same 5% guidance? The reason I ask this is I've run some drift tests where the heart rate average of the first segment was 6 or 7%, sometimes more than the heart rate at the end of the warm up.
Okay. Well, yeah, but we haven't had a heart rate drift test question for a while, but let me start off by saying, when you say you're doing two 30-minute segments, I hope those are contiguous and continuous.
Mhm.
So you're not stopping at 30 minutes and then doing another one at some other time. Because what we want to be able to do is have this be roughly an hour long test. That sometimes it's not a full hour, but close to an hour test where we can compare the first half of the test with the second half of the test, heart rate wise. So if you're doing that, then I just want to make sure you're understanding that's the way it needs to be done. And typically, yes, I like to see the heart rate stabilize um, at a number that feels aerobic to you. So feels relatively easy, something you could sustain for well over an hour if you needed to. So in your case, getting your heart rate stabilized at around 130, and by stabilized, what we typically mean with that is the heart rate doesn't continue to climb for maybe 3 to 5 minutes. So at the end of your warm up, the last 5 minutes are done at a speed that will elicit a 130 heart rate without it climbing. And it sounds like you did that quite well, because the fact that you stabilized at 130, but then the average of the first half was 132, it only went up a couple beats. So I don't think you can complain too much about that, about having done that wrong. So your question, I guess I answered the first part. Yeah, that the heart rate at the end of the warm up should be pretty darn close to where you think you're going to be starting. So yeah, you did that right. And yes, would use the same, excuse me, 5% guidance. And you're at roughly 4%, so you're within that 5%. And I mean, in your case, I would use 130 heart rate because that was your starting heart rate. I would use that as the top of zone 2 or the aerobic threshold. Um, So the final question was, let's see, I have run some drift tests where the heart rate average of the first segment was 6 or 7% more than the heart rate at the end of the warm up. Well, chances are you then maybe didn't stabilize the heart rate at the end of the warm up, because if it climbs 6 or 7% just in the first 30 minutes, that means it's probably going to have climbed, 15% to 20% by the time you get to the end of the hour. And that's just way too much. So my guess is on those, you may have started a little too fast.
What I would add, as someone who has looked at a ton of heart rate drift tests for my athletes, if you look at training peaks and you look at the full hour 20 or hour 30 test, hopefully these segments are just kind of like time lapses and they're not full restarts, because you'll be able to see this clearly. Sometimes you'll see that the heart rate stabilizes maybe once you've started the test, like you've kept the speed the same, but you're still maybe in a warm-up zone. There's a ton of athletes who need at least 30 minutes even for their heart rate to stabilize, their aerobic system to be fully where it should be and warmed up. So I sometimes even clip people's data, like maybe I'm actually looking at the last 40 minutes or the last 50 minutes, and I'm giving the warm up a little more space, and I'm not including that in the final drift results if you're seeing a huge jump from start of warm up to end of warm up and then start of test to end of test, if that's helpful.
Yeah. I mean, and the when those of you that are using Training Peaks for this test, which is what we recommend, because it's visually easy to see and it's also easy to calculate these percentage increase. But for those of you that are doing that, one of the things, if you look at the workout graph, where it shows heart rate and it can collect speed and other data, but the heart rate, the little red line for heart rate, should almost appear flat, horizontal. It should not be, because an increase of only 3 or 4% over an hour, you're only barely going to see a slight let's see, increase or gradient in that line as it moves from left to right. So hopefully that made some sense and I didn't just confuse people. So the next question is about a plan that you wrote, I think this is perfect for you to answer. And the question, this is written in by AJ. And he's saying, I purchased the rim to rim plan as I'm doing a 50 miler with 11,000 vertical feet elevation gain and loss in the fall. Last year, I completed my first 55 kilometer with 7,500 feet of vertical, just shy of 11 hours. I feel like a lot of the long runs and back-to-back sessions are tailored to runners with a faster pace than I have. Given I'm looking at closer to 14 to 15 hours to complete the 50 miles, should I be increasing my time on feet duration during the week and long runs to better prepare myself for the rigors of that distance? For example, the peak week has a 4-hour back-to-back, and that doesn't seem like enough.
Well, first of all, AJ, congrats on your 55 completion in 11 hours. That's amazing. This is a really solid question, and I want to hopefully break it down. So in general, I wrote this plan for anyone attempting rim to rim to rim, fast or not. The aim of the training was to build fatigue resistance week after week for this type of mileage and this type of vertical. And you'll kind of see with some of the bigger volume weeks, the volume is spread out throughout the week, not just on the weekend or on 1 or 2 days. There is a caveat. So if you're someone who has some training history, which it sounds like you do, and you know that you can recover really well from these big training days, then I would absolutely encourage you to get out for some bigger days, maybe 6 or 8 hour days, if you know you can really recover well and train again. This is a stock plan. This is where coaches come in and are helpful to be able to tell you how exactly to tailor your training for your training history and past load and how long it takes you to recover. The only concern, and why I would never in a stock plan say, like, go out and do a 10-hour run, is you run the risk of not only injuring yourself, but also completely detraining by the time you then recover from a 10-hour thing. If you know you don't recover well, if you need to take a week off training just to do that one long day, I think it's kind of counterproductive in the end. But if you know you can kind of get in some large weekends and you'll recover and it's going to build your confidence, and you know you're kind of like headed into a recovery week, that's probably where I'd time it, and you don't miss other crucial building parts of this training plan, I think you'll be totally fine. Scott, do you have more to say about that?
Yeah, I'm going to reiterate something you touched on, but I want to expand on a little bit, and that is that all of the plans we sell, they are stock training plans. What that means is they're sort of one size fits all. So
Yes.
just like if you went into the store to buy a jacket and they only had one size, there's a not very good chance that it's going to fit you perfectly. So
Mm-hmm.
we consider these plans as kind of the bare minimum. So because we can't write the plan, like in your case, AJ, you may very well be able to handle bigger volume than this. But if we tell somebody who doesn't have your training history and background that, they need to be doing X number of hours, then there's a good chance they could end up getting injured or overtrained. So we're going to almost always, even with the athletes we coach, we'll err on the conservative side when it comes to training load. Um, so that's my first point. And the second is that, I coach some, and Maya does too, some, professional ultra runners, and we rarely have them run more than 3 or 4 hours. Rarely. I mean, maybe if there's a course inspection for UTMB and they're going to go out and, spend 6 or 7 hours on a segment of the course, but that's so rare that it's just not even worth considering, frankly. And these people are
Yeah.
racing 100 to 100 plus miles pretty darn fast. And I think it's kind of maybe a misunderstanding that you need to be able to do the thing before you actually do the thing. Be
Mm-hmm.
able to handle a 14-hour day. Um, if you're fit enough, and as Maya said, you recover well, then yeah, maybe you do want to do two 6 hour days because you think it's going to take you that, or maybe it's two 5 hour days. So you think you're going to take that long to do it, which is not, that's a pretty fast time. So and I like doing those. The way we often do this is what Maya did in this plan. We stack the long runs back to back because they don't allows you to slightly recover, but you enter the second day in with a somewhat depleted glycogen storage. So you get a lot of the training effect of having done a really long, a 1 day long run, but it's nowhere near as taxing. And so you recover faster, which means you can get back to the other training more quickly than if just as Maya mentioned, just trashed yourself on a 8 or 10
10-hour
hour
day.
day, then
Yeah.
maybe it's going to take you a week to recover from that.
Yeah. Thanks, Scott. So our
Okay.
next question, um, this is an interesting one, and Scott and I talked about this. This person says, "Hello, thank you so much for addressing all these questions every month. I have a question regarding how nutrition affects heart rate on any given day. Some days I wake up and have a proper breakfast. We're not exactly sure what that means, but it says proper breakfast. Wait 2 to 3 hours to digest and then train. Other days I wake up and have a banana or cereal bar and start training within 30 minutes. I have noticed on that second case, when I have a small breakfast, quickly followed by a workout, my heart rate tends to be lower for the same effort, zone 1, zone 2, than when I have bigger breakfast and the workout follows later in the day. I would expect the opposite to happen, lower heart rate after proper digestion and regulation of the nervous system. What could be some of the factors attributing to that? Could it be because of difference on the levels of glucose or insulin in the blood, difference in glycogen depletion, circadian rhythm, difference on the nervous system? I'm starting to think that my aerobic threshold tests may not have been very accurate because of this. Thank you in advance. Every month, I'm looking forward to your podcast." Thank you. That's so kind of you.
Yeah, that's
Scott,
great.
do you want to
Well, the
start off?
answer to the question is all of the above. So all of those things that you ask the question about could, some of these other factors, but it could be glucose, insulin, glycogen depletion, circadian rhythm. Yeah,
Caffeine input. That was my first question reading
caffeine
that
would be
question is like,
yeah,
when are you taking your caffeine? And is it when you do a big breakfast or before or after? That'd be something I'd consider.
yeah. And like Maya said, we don't know exactly what a big breakfast is, but it's obviously more than just, a bar. But is that, four scrambled eggs and toast and bacon and some hash browns, or you're talking about, a big bowl of muesli, or we don't really know. Um, but I think you're right to be confused, and I don't know that we have a great answer for you here, for this person. This is a pretty complicated question, but I wouldn't be too suspicious about your aerobic threshold, the drift tests. Have they been accurate or not? Excuse me. If you really wanted to be sure, you could certainly do a drift test after the big breakfast, 2 or 3 hours, and then do a drift test after the small breakfast, and see if those drift tests are how different they are. I'd be really curious. If you find this out and you want to let us know, I'd love to know.
Please do.
Um,
You could
but
also do a drift test fasted if you're really
yeah,
interested. We did used to recommend that for some people. So
yeah.
that's an idea as
Um,
well.
Like if you went into a lab to do like a metabolic flexibility or metabolic efficiency test, they would have you arrive in a fasted state after an overnight fast, so that then blood glucose levels are going to be low, glycogen storage will be relatively low, and they get a pretty good picture of the fat carbohydrate balance. But aside from that, I think doing a drift test in a fasted state is not at all a bad idea. I would, and
Yeah.
I one other question, one other thought I had on this after reading it over. We scratched our heads over this for a few minutes and trying to figure out how we might be able to help this person. But depending on your how much you're training, you might want to consider waking up and going out and doing that run, right away. Well, as soon as you're awake and ready to go, rather than eating anything, just go out in a fasted state. Now, I've written a lot about fasted training. It has some upsides and some downsides, so you have to be a little careful with it. But if you're training at a relatively low volume, and by that I mean maybe 6 to 8 maybe hours of aerobic work in a week, 6 hours, you're going to have plenty of time to replenish glycogen stores again, after between workouts. Whereas if you were training twice a day and training, 18 hours a week, then you don't need to do fasted training because you're always going to be in this glycogen diminished state. But there might be something to experiment with, and you know, monitor how they feel to you. And if it's really affecting your recovery, then you might not be able to do these. But typically I do fasted workouts, fasted runs in the morning, just because I don't like to try to run with my belly full. Doesn't feel very good. So I just get up, have a cup of tea, and head out the door. Um, and what I find then is I want to, and you need to eat um, within about a 20 to 30-minute window at the afterwards. So if you are driving some distance to a trailhead, take some food with you so that you can start to restore those glycogen stores. Um, and one last comment on fasted training, since we're on that subject, is it does pose more risk for women than men.
Yeah.
So if this person is a woman who wrote in, then you might want to consider that. But it's still, doing one or two fasted runs in a week is not, especially if you're only training in the 6 hour range, it's not going to, I don't think it's going to mess you up. So and if you feel like, hey, it's not working, I don't recover well, then just stop. You don't have to continue.
And just another note, if you are a woman and you are doing fasted training, make sure you do not do it for 1 week out of the month. If you still have menses and you still have your cycle, that should be your luteal phase. If you are through menopause, you should still pick 1 week out of the month where you're not doing fasted training or intermittent fasting, just as a side note. The other note I was just going to say about the heart rate, you didn't give a range like, oh, my heart rate's 10 beats higher when I eat or 10 beats slower when I eat a different meal. I would say if it's an average of like 3 to 4 beats, it probably isn't that impactful. And heart rate changes just normally, regardless. It's a proxy for intensity. If you're really stressed, if you didn't get sleep, if you had an extra cup of coffee, your heart rate may have, you might feel an effect. And that's not necessarily going to ruin your training if you're training one day with your heart rate 3 beats higher and one day 3 beats lower. So just wanted to put that out there as well. Easy to get
Yeah, I think
attached to
that's
one number. And we're more
exactly.
complex than that. We've just
We are,
simplified as heart rate.
yes, we are way more complex than that. That's why
Yeah.
heart rate, while we are sort of forced to use it for the kind of sports that we do, it's a very imperfect proxy for
Yeah. I
workload
mean, I
and
tell all my
endurance.
athletes lactate testing would be much better. If we could just prick
Yeah.
everyone every 10 minutes, that would be a much
Hmm.
better accurate proxy for intensity, but
Yes,
very
exactly.
ineffective and
Yeah.
inefficient
Very,
for us.
very inefficient and difficult to do.
Yeah.
Um, But I think that I think that's a really good point that there's going to be days when, and maybe this person is running on the days when your heart rate is higher, maybe you're running faster because
Yeah.
you had
More fuel on board.
you have more fuel on board. And so I think you have to consider all of those things. I will say one last thing about fasted training is unless you are very accustomed to doing it and have done it for a long time, don't try to do an intensity session. So maybe some kind of interval workout or a
Yeah.
muscular endurance workout on a day when you're doing fasted training. Reserve the fasted training for easy, whether maybe it's a recovery run, maybe it's zone 1 or 2, but reserve it for those kind of very aerobic work. Don't use it when you need glycogen on board to fuel the higher intensity.
Same with strength training. If you're going to the gym, make sure you fuel before to lift
Yeah,
or any type of strength training.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Our words of caution about fasted training. We got to have them. These are the
Yes.
warnings.
Yes.
Um, okay, I'm going to read this one to you as well. This next person asks, does increased water retention due to carbohydrate intake actually help with hydration? And I personally did not know the answer to this. And so that's why I'm asking Scott.
It's an interesting question, but if the water is inside your body, then yes, it's helping with hydration. I mean, you can obviously overhydrate. That's called hyponatremia, no, natremia. I can't remember.
I think so.
Where you've got, you have so much water on board that your electrolyte balance gets out of whack, and that can be serious. It can even be fatal. So over drinking isn't very healthy. But the water that you drink in, the water that you don't pee out right away, that water is going into the cells and all the cells of your body because they all, we are, I think 80% of our weight is water. So you're going to have water in muscle cells and, all the cells in your body are going to be more topped up. So in theory, it should definitely help with, delaying a dehydration state. Um,
I think that's so interesting.
yeah. Um, Yeah, and I've known people that do what they call cameling up, which is, they know they're going to go out for this long thing today, and they just drink a lot of water in the beginning because they know they're going to be sweating it off and peeing it
With
off, and
electrolytes or just straight water?
usually with electrolytes, some kind of.
Yeah.
But if you had like a meal with a bunch of water. Well, the meal most likely is going to have electrolytes in it. Just by,
Yeah.
the food that you eat is going to have some of that too. But for, the simplicity, there's tons of electrolyte drink mixes out there. Um,
Yeah. I'm drinking mine right now
yeah.
as we record this. Um, great. Let's see. So our
Okay. So
next
maybe
question, do you want me
I get
to,
to read one to you
you want to read
now.
one? Okay.
Yes. Okay. Um, And this one we have an answer from our sport medicine doc, Andy Reid, who's also a coach with us, because I think this is definitely a medical type of a question. We
Mhm.
don't we're not doctors, so we're not physical therapists.
Sadly, we're not qualified, Scott and I, to
Yeah.
fully answer this.
So luckily we have somebody we can reach out to for this kind of thing. So the question
Yeah.
this person is asking is how to deal with IT band syndrome during a training block besides seeing a physical therapist. Now,
So,
yeah,
do you
go
want
ahead,
to
Maya.
read his answer or do you want me to?
Well, I wanted to just clarify what IT band syndrome is.
Great.
And that is it's the iliotibial band. So it's basically a like 2 foot long tendon that runs down the
Hmm.
outside of your thigh. It attaches to a muscle up in the hip area. And then at the other end, it attaches just below the kneecap on the tibia. So that's what IT band syndrome is. It can get really tight and aggravating, and it, kind of rubbing across the bone because it's too tight will cause irritation and pain in the knee. So,
Okay, so Dr. Andy Reid says the basic cause, and this is what Scott just described, but I'm going to say what his definition. The basic cause is friction between the far end of the IT band and the lateral femur during repetitive knee flexion and extension, common in runners and cyclists. Unfortunately, it's only one of the few injuries that does best with avoiding the aggravating activity. So usually a period of cross training or at least reduced volume of running is needed. I'd say reduce cycling too, if that's what's aggravating it. So his initial recommendations would be reduce activities that exacerbate symptoms, particularly downhill running and prolonged sitting. Anti-inflammatory strategies, icing, and NSAIDs, which
yeah,
is,
non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs.
I knew he would have the acronym ready to go.
Yeah.
because hip weakness has been cited as a cause, hip abductor strengthening, particularly gluteus medius, seems very useful. So there's lots of different exercises you can do to strengthen the glute med. He does not recommend foam rolling for the IT band, which I think is really interesting as a coach, because usually when athletes have issues, I'm like, get on a roller. It's not stretchable and it's very painful and irritating. You can get a ball into the glutes and the TFL at the front and side of the hip where it's a more muscular, and this can help, but avoid like getting in there with a foam roller or a ball on the IT band because it's already inflamed. All injuries are caused by training error to some extent. So have a coach look at training program. Did you ramp up the mileage or intensity too quickly? Consider gait analysis to evaluate for overstriding, hip internal rotation, or pelvic drop. So that was his answer for us.
Yeah, that's
Scott, do you have more
great.
to add?
Only thing I might add, I mean, I've tried in the past when it's been years since I had IT band syndrome, and I thought I could help it by rolling the on that lateral side of
Mm-hmm.
my femur, and he's right, it's incredibly painful. Um,
Yeah.
and it didn't really seem to have an effect, didn't really seem to loosen anything up. So one of the things he's mentioning here is that you could get a ball, and by this it could be a tennis ball, or they make these special harder balls for rolling on that you
I'm
can
showing a
then,
ball for all the people who are just listening.
okay, great. Yeah, and you can get that way into the glutes, the gluteus medius, which is kind of most of the way around. It's like halfway between, how would I describe it? It's on the side of your hip. But then
Yeah.
there's also the tensor fasciculata, that's the TFL. That is another one that you can get into, and it's kind of on the front side of the hip. So
Yeah.
because since the IT band is essentially a tendon,
Mm-hmm.
trying to make them, get the muscles to stretch and relax is way more effective than actually trying to, do something with this tendon that's already irritated and already, under a lot of tension. So loosen the muscle up.
Yeah, it sounds like it's like a tendonitis, and I have a lot of experience with that. So maybe also heat in that area would probably be recommended. That's what I
Yeah.
would do. Loosen up those muscles. Yeah,
Hmm. Yeah.
awesome. Okay, the next question is, What or how do you deal with chronic ankle instability with trail athletes? And Scott has a story for you about his own ankle instability when he started trail running. So I'll let him take it away.
Yeah, many, many years ago, probably now close to 50 years ago, I hate to say it, when I first began to run in the mountains and run on trails, I had very loose ankles, very floppy ankles, and I assumed, and I don't have any science to back this up, it was because as a young guy, I swam competitively, and so swimmers have, as you can imagine, because of the kicking with your legs, your ankles do a lot of flexing, and I always assumed, oh, that my ankles are just loose because of all this the swimming I've done. And the ligaments in my ankles were so relaxed that I would roll my ankle, probably, a couple, 2 or 3 times a summer, and the outside ankle bone would hit the ground. It was that far. And it wouldn't be, it was like, oh, that doesn't feel very good, but it wasn't like normal. A normal person, if you did that, you'd tear something and you'd have what they call a sprained ankle. But in my case, because the ligaments I think were so loose, it just would flop over on its side, and it'd be uncomfortable a little bit, but it wasn't, I could still run. Let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So if you've got, the ankle instability could be coming from two things. One is muscle strength in the lower legs, and the other is what I was just talking about, where the ligaments are too lax. They need to be tightened up. And so, what I would recommend you do is look at very closely at the anatomy of the lower leg, the muscle anatomy of the lower leg. You'll see that it's a real complex bunch of muscles that both control the what they call dorsiflexion and dorsiflexion, and then lateral flexion as well. And you could probably improve ankle stability by getting on a pretty rigorous program of ankle movements and exercises. That could be things like you know, toe raises, leaning against the wall with your butt on the wall and your heels a foot or so out from the wall and lifting your toes repeatedly.
Mhm.
That can be helpful. Another can be, heel raises. So you stand on one leg if you can and do a bunch of, heel raises. The lateral muscles are a little harder to train. They're best trained like where I really feel those lateral muscles. In fact, today when I was out on a run and I was off trail was side hilling, because the side
Mm.
hilling puts your ankle, naturally into this flexion. So the downhill leg,
Yeah.
the ankle's going to be, the heel's going to be flexed toward the midline, and the uphill leg is going to be flexed to medially out to the outside. And when I do that kind of thing of side hilling a bunch, I can really feel those muscles. How to train that, in a more controlled setting in a gym. Maybe you stand on a slant board sideways. Um,
Yeah.
Something like that might help. But yeah, I wish you luck. I hope you can come to grips with it and actually improve it. Strength training, what I should have said this, the strength training may in fact help the stability because you're making those muscles stronger, but it may also help the stability because there could be some carryover to the ligaments. Again, not being a doctor, I can't say that for sure.
Yeah. I would also add like working balance as much as you can in the gym, outside. And if you don't have as steep of a side hill, or if you're new to this, and if you live somewhere like a beach or a grassy hill, go walk across that. I know whenever I'm on the beach or running on the beach, I get the same like lateral feeling. So that's a way to kind of think about things and play with, and running around on rocks is a good way to kind
Yeah.
of practice without it being a steep downhill trail run.
Yeah. I wouldn't recommend like an ankle brace or
No.
relying on high top shoes. The ankle brace may in fact limit that lateral side-to-side movement that keeps you, when you say you're rolling your ankle, but it's not going to help you strengthen that stuff. So unless you have a really bad problem with this, I think an ankle brace is not a great solution. And then I would also probably not recommend high top shoes. They just aren't going to be high enough. Unless like if you look at like cross country ski boots, a skating boot, for instance, the boots that are used for cross country skating and skiing, they have a carbon fiber cuff that goes, quite a ways up the lower leg to stiffen the ankle laterally. But I've never seen anything that looks like a running shoe or a hiking shoe that had a carbon fiber upper cuff like that. So yeah, and it would be really uncomfortable to try to run in those ski boots.
When in doubt, go see a PT. That would also be
Yes.
my recommendation. Awesome. Okay.
Okay. Next question here is from Brad. I'm really enjoying the question and answer sessions. Thanks for sharing your insight in this series of podcasts. My question pertains to aerobic base maintenance after ADS, which is aerobic deficiency syndrome, is cured. How much weekly zone 1 and zone 2 work is required to maintain aerobic base after you've cured this aerobic deficiency?
What a great question. It's a little hard to know because I don't know what your training volume and background is. And I think Scott would say the same thing. There's no magic number. And once ADS is cured, that doesn't mean you have fully developed your aerobic base. You don't have aerobic deficiency syndrome. That's great. You kind of like completed step 1. But to build a really robust aerobic base, you could do that for 10 years. So I would say at least 3 times a week, get out for a zone 1, zone 2 session if you're trying to just go into a maintenance phase or you're not really training for anything. But if you have big goals, I would say at least probably 4 days a week of at least an hour session each to maintain and keep building that base training. Scott, do you have more to add about that?
Only to to use an extreme example. I mean, just because, a world-class marathoner is not aerobically deficient, yet they
Right.
still do 100+ mile running weeks, and that's to help maintain that base. They've probably maxed out because they've been at this for many years. They've probably maxed out their aerobic threshold, heart rate and aerobic base, but they need to maintain it. And remember that the biggest stimulus to developing this basic aerobic capacity is the volume of training you do. So I would be reluctant. I mean, these should be mainstays in your session. These zone 1 and 2 workouts should definitely be mainstays. You could add a little bit of intensity one day. I would try to make one of those runs, depending on how many hours or miles you're running in a week. I think when you get to 2 hours, you're starting to, you've depleted glycogen pretty severely. And recall that the biggest stimulus for aerobic development is glycogen depletion in the muscle itself. So going 2 hours and longer will have a pretty pronounced effect on improving that aerobic fitness.
Yeah, it's a good thing to add. We did actually skip a question, so I'm going to go back to it from Brian. This is a good one, Scott, because this is something we used to talk about when I was a junior. I often compete in trail races that start out going uphill. VKs are one example where the intensity is very high the entire time. Another example is a race last weekend in Missoula that started out on a grade for 4 miles with no breaks. I need a warm-up routine that I can adapt and use consistently. I'm usually less warmed up than I should be. Should I jog a couple miles, then do some strides? Should my heart rate be really elevated before the start? Ideally, I think I would arrive at the start with a fully elevated heart rate and sweaty, and then the gun goes off, but that's hard to manage. What do you recommend?
Well, he nailed it. Brian, you nailed it. So, first of all, the warm up for a shorter, more intense race like a VK, that's a vertical kilometer, where you're going uphill and from the gun, you're going about as hard as you can go and you're going to sustain that for the whole time. The shorter and more intense the race, the longer the warm up needs to be, which is a little confusing or counterintuitive, I think, for many people. But you need to start off very slowly and easily warming up. And often I would tell, wear a little extra clothes so you heat up faster. And then you want to finish, just like you said there, Brian, you want to finish that warm up with your heart rate, close to what you think it's going to be when the gun goes off. Within let's say, maybe you're going to finish this. So you have a VK that lasts 45 minutes for most people. And you're going to finish that, and you're going to probably have an average heart rate. Let's just pick a number out of the blue, 160 average heart rate, 165 maybe have your average heart rate for this. You'll want to finish the warm up, the last 10 minutes, with several short, intense runs. They can be uphill that elevate your heart rate at least up into the 150s. So as you pointed out, you want to hit the start sweaty with a heart rate elevated. That's way less important with long runs. By long, I mean, excuse me, runs that last over several hours. So if you're doing a 50-kilometer run, you just don't need that much warm up for those, because you should not be starting so fast. That you should be, the first part of the run can still be part of your warm up. So in a long race like that, I think most of the people I've worked with, they might warm up for 15 minutes or something and just jogging around, but they don't want necessarily an elevated heart rate. In fact, one of the pro runners I work with, we noticed that when he had a poor race one time, his heart rate at the start was 112. And this is a guy with a resting heart rate of in the high 30s. And so he was pretty excited, obviously. And but in another race he did just recently, where his performance was very good and he felt strong in that, his heart rate was 72 at the start. So on these were 100-kilometer races. So I just, you don't need to have one warm up routine. Now, one of the things, Maya, maybe you can recollect how you used to do your warm ups for ski races, and how you carried a bag out there to near the stadium start and had extra clothes and all that stuff in it. So why don't you give us a rundown on how that used to work for you?
Yeah, and this is something I do with a lot of my athletes too, who are racers. Like, we usually talk through the race the week of, and we work back from the start time. And this is something Scott taught me. So his rule of thumb, as he just explained, the shorter the race, the longer the warm up, the longer the race, the shorter the warm up, because you're going to warm up into it. So for, let's say, a sprint race for me was a few minutes, so much shorter than even a VK. I would give myself at least an hour, and I would do at least 20 to 30 minutes of zone 1, zone 2 warming up. And then I would probably take off a layer. And then I would probably do, I don't know, 2 by 8 minutes, zone 3. And then at that point, since I was a ski racer, it was cold, I'm sweaty, I would go into the lodge or wherever my bag was and change into a dry shirt, usually put on my race top and bib. This is going to be different for each event, but this is something I do teach my other runners. Like, make sure you have a change of clothes if that is like something that's good for you. That's when I'd eat a little bit, have a goo, have your energy drink, whatever you do. And then I'd go out and do some quick speeds, and I'd usually put a jacket back on. So I'd have a warm up jacket back on, and I would do, I don't know, 10 by 10 seconds or little starts, kind of depending on what the race was. And this is for a shorter race. For a longer race, similar like routine, but I'd probably warm up for 30 minutes, wouldn't do as much high intensity, change, and then do maybe a couple starts, because I would know I'm going to get going as the race goes on. But even my longest races are a lot shorter than ultra runs. So you can kind of tailor it to your event. But I would say actually start, instead of thinking about your warm up day of, think about it 3 days before and think about what you want and time that stuff out and think through it. I think it's really helpful.
Yeah, and thinking specifically about Brian's race here, which had started out with 4 miles uphill with no brakes. So
Yeah,
yeah, obviously you want to be warmed up for that. But I think one of the things that we have noticed with an ultra running is that many people start too fast.
way too
And
fast. Yeah,
thinking that you are going to somehow win that race or do well in the first half of the race. No, no, the race really starts after the halfway point. And
yep,
so, sacrificing, you know, in 4 miles, maybe, you slow down enough, you sacrifice a couple minutes to somebody that you're competing closely with. Well, that, and then having you have plenty of legs left in the second half of that race, so that you then start reeling in all those people that were running a little bit above their capacity.
yeah.
This is something
No, I
I've
would
talked
use
about.
that.
Go
I
ahead,
would use
sorry.
those 4 miles uphill as kind of the warm up for the high intensity work. I would probably
Yeah.
be warm. I wouldn't want to be shivering at the start. So go do some aerobic running, feel like you're solidly in zone two. But I probably wouldn't do any high intensity for a race like that and know that those first 4 miles, you're going to let people go ahead and that's okay. And you'll catch them on the downhill. And like Scott said, the second half of the race. That's
Yeah, and
usually
we
how
don't know
I
exactly how
advise my
long
athletes.
we don't really
If
know how
it's
long
five
this race
miles,
was.
then
Yeah, that's
yeah,
a different
then
thing. If it's a 5 mile race with 4 miles of uphill, then
then do
yeah,
the
that's
sprint
quite
warm up.
different.
I just
Yes, then you
explained.
need the
Yeah.
short, yeah, the sprint. Um, but one of the things this brings up for me thinking more about pacing in these ultra long events
Hmm.
that in especially, with your cross country ski background, doing something like a sprint or even a 10K, if you make a pacing mistake in the beginning, you are going to know it within seconds
Yeah.
and be able to correct, like, oh, I better slow down. I know I can't handle this, can't keep this up. Whereas
Yeah.
because the speeds are quite low in these ultra races, far below your maximum running speed, it's very hard to gauge, how hard is too hard. And with the adrenaline going and the excitement of and having your competitors all around you early in the race, it you can make this pacing error. Again, it could just be, 20 seconds a mile difference, a mistake that could then cost you, you know, 10 minutes a mile later in the
Later.
race where you're having to
Hmm.
walk instead of running because you went out too hard. So I
Yeah.
think I know I've said this over and over in these Ask Evoke because we get questions like that a lot, but it's definitely something I have seen in the ultra running world that I think people are not as well tuned into as they could be.
I agree. Yeah. Um,
Okay, next
okay.
question is from Brad, right?
No, we just
No,
answered
we
Brad's.
did
It's the
Brad, sorry.
Q&A question about
Yeah.
capacity.
Okay. So this one is it says Q&A question, capacity versus utilization training. I do trail running and ski touring. I love the week-to-week training, but don't have a big objective usually. How do I alter your training plans to just build myself up to go faster and longer in the long term at a sustainable rate? I assume that skipping a taper, a race, and the long recovery afterward would keep more money in the bank.
Okay. So I actually have an athlete who seems like has the exact same schedule as you. Really into ski touring in the winter and then does like 50-mile link ups in the mountains running in the summer. In the winter, he runs a little bit on the treadmill just to keep his running legs, but maybe once a week. He mostly ski tours. And then in the summer, we do some uphill hiking that will translate into ski touring, but we're really focused on running. So I'm not sure exactly which training plans you've bought. You could always reach out to a coach for a custom plan that might be helpful in some of those transition periods where you're not sure. But what I do with him, and I would encourage anyone who doesn't have a big race objective or goal, is still try to periodize your training. So we have training blocks. Let's take the fall. We'll start in the fall and I'll work through the seasons. So in the fall, we will probably take a little bit of time between his running objectives and skiing to recover. That might look like a week of just easier running and hiking. And then we'll kind of go into a bit more of a strength building for his legs. And I would probably start doing some muscular endurance around December to get him really ready. And then through the winter, we use that as a pretty big volume phase because you can get so much more volume on skis than you can running without injury. So through the winter, we're doing some maintenance strength training, but we're mostly doing volume building. And sometimes like he goes off the book because he's like, oh, the snow is great. We did an 8-hour tour. And I'm like, that's awesome. You do that. And then as ski season wraps up, kind of like a lot of competitors, we take a down period. I give him a few weeks off where we're not training and we let him reset. And then we start going into running again, easing into running. And then we'll kind of spend the spring into summer starting to add some more specific running workouts. That could be intervals uphill, that could be power work like hill sprints. This year, I want him to do some uphill weighted intervals that we've done with some of our ultra runners because he's really strong. I think that would be great for him. And then we kind of tailor it. So he doesn't have traditional tapers like you would for a big race, but he will have a taper for one of his big link ups. And he doesn't have like the massive recovery periods that you would see if you get back from a mountain like Denali or Everest. But we still kind of mimic those flows, those ebbs and flows, the periodization part of our training. And that's been really effective. So that's my answer. I'm sure Scott will have more notes as well.
Well, only a couple of things, but I think whoever asked this question, I'm not sure male or female, but is that you're correct that by not having a taper or race and a long recover afterwards allows you to have a longer buildup phase. And
For sure.
so I think you're right about that. And that from a long-term standpoint, that will be better. But there, as Maya was saying, there needs to be some periodization. Some periods where there's a high volume at lower intensity, other periods where there's more of a focus on strength and muscular endurance or uphill intensity. Because if you just keep doing the same thing over and over and over for, maybe initially you will benefit, but, after a couple of cycles of this kind of training, maybe, a year or two, you may start to plateau and you need a different stimulus. If you're just doing always all the same, just going out for long runs and long skis, that's great, but it probably you're going to reach a kind of a plateau and you need a different stimulus at that point. So you can still use these ideas Maya was talking about where, we do periodize. We do have different blocks of training, even for folks that are not racing.
Yeah. All right. We got another question from Pedro, and he says, we're starting to see more African runners break into the trail running scene. Some have been very successful, but overall, they haven't been as dominant as many of us have expected, at least not yet. This is somewhat surprising, especially considering how they've dominated in road running. Why do you think this is the case, and what might we learn from it? And are there any lessons or insights that could be even helpful, inform or reinforce our training methodologies? Thank you.
Well, this is a great question, Pedro, and it's one I have pondered for some time. And I would say a few years ago, I was fairly convinced that once there was enough money in trail running, mountain running, we would see a bigger influx of African runners coming into those races. But I think they would have been like second tier. They're still incredible athletes and incredible runners, but they're not going to be the people that are winning the Chicago Marathon. They're the ones who can't quite reach that level. So they're not going to make any money on road running. So they're going to switch over to trails. And I was pretty sure that was going to upend, maybe end the dominance of the Caucasians in all these races. It hasn't happened. There have been a few runners, the African runners that have done well. They tend to go for the shorter races. And when I've talked to a couple of the pros I coach about this, I've said, what do you think is holding those why aren't we seeing better performance in these longer races than these Africans? And what they have said is, and it makes a lot of sense to me. Well, first, just look at the legs of a mountain runner, as a, a high-level elite mountain runner, and compare those to the legs of a world-class marathoner. I mean, the mountain runner legs are going to look like tree trunks, and the world-class road runner is going to have these sticks for legs because they're very different demands. The turnover, the tempo is faster and turnover is higher in road running. But I think what these two in particular pros that I'm talking about told me is they think that those guys don't have the strength and durability to handle all the downhills. They have a tremendous motor, and maybe with some focused training on building more strength in their legs, they would be able to perform better in these long races. But that's kind of my take on it. It's just that they don't have the durability to last in those long races, whereas somebody that's got more muscle mass would be. And any lessons or insights from that could help inform or reinforce training methodologies, I would say, well, I'll tell you what my answer to this is the single biggest thing that's going to cause you to slow down in any endurance event, but especially in ultra long endurance events, is local muscular fatigue. And so what we can learn from this is all ultra runners should have training included in their plan that focuses on building fatigue resistance in the main propelling muscles. If you're not doing that and all you're doing is running, you're missing a pretty significant part of what could help you run faster. So that kind of ties in with what I was saying about the mountain runners generally having tree trunks for legs.
Strength train,
Yeah, do
muscular
some
endurance.
strength training and muscular endurance. Yep.
Yeah. Do you want to read this
Okay.
question?
Next question is from Matthew. And it's a long one, so bear with me.
Maybe we can almost do it in
We have to
sections because
answer in a
there's like
couple of,
three
yeah.
questions within it.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and they're embedded in a paragraph format, so it's a little tricky to
Hmm.
pick them out. For folks that are listening to this, if you write in with multiple questions, if you could put them in sort of a bullet point format, it's a lot easier
Yeah.
for us to see
One,
them and
two,
address
three.
them and make sure
Yeah.
we don't miss anything. So, okay, Matthew, here we go. My aerobic threshold is 130, and my anaerobic threshold is 165. By your definition, I am aerobically deficient. Does exercising between aerobic threshold and anaerobic threshold, or in zone 3, actually reduce aerobic capacity, or does it merely slow down aerobic capacity development? And by what mechanism would it slow down that development? So let's start with those two questions right there, because actually there's three. Does running a lot in zone 3 or zone 3 actually reduce aerobic capacity? So let's start with
Yes.
that question.
You want me to take it? I don't
Yeah,
know,
if you
Scott,
want, go ahead.
this is your bread and butter. You're so good at explaining. Um, yes, it does reduce your aerobic based training is the simplest way to answer that. And I think
Yeah.
Scott should go into the science of why that's happening because he does a much better job explaining it than I do.
Well, yeah, I think that you're still in a pretty aerobic state in zone 3, especially in low zone 3. Now, for people
Mm-hmm.
who are not aerobically deficient, zone 3 is pretty small. Like in your case, Matthew, your zone 3 is 35 beats. But it's not
Mm-hmm.
at all uncommon for an elite athlete to have a zone 3 that's only 6 or 7 beats wide
Yeah.
before they reach their anaerobic threshold. But I've said this earlier in our discussion today that the single biggest stimulus for the single most effective stimulus for improving aerobic capacity is the volume of the training you're doing. It's the reason that marathon runners or elite marathon runners are running 100 plus miles a week. Same for elite ultra runners. They need that in order to either build it in the first place or to maintain it as they become at a higher level. So doing some zone three, depending on how much and how intense it is, like if you're doing your zone three at 160 heart rate, Matthew, where your anaerobic threshold is 165, that's going to be a pretty taxing workout and probably will require you to reduce some of the aerobic base volume. So you're going to be cutting into the aerobic base training, which, as I just pointed out, that's the biggest, if you cut back on the volume, you're going to probably slow the development of aerobic capacity. Now, if you did these zone three workouts at 140, that's going to be a different thing. That's much more aerobic than 160. So you're going to see, faster recovery time, more aerobic stimulus. And so, think about it that way, maybe instead of just calling, zone three is not just a singularity. It's a whole, in your case, especially with 35 beats, it's quite a spectrum in intensity.
Mhm.
And while we're on this subject, I think there's something. I mean, I've written about this certainly in the first book, but when you train at higher intensities, your body is producing more lactic acid, which, as we've talked about before, is broken down. I mean, because we're in your body, it's an aqueous environment inside the muscle cell. That lactic acid is broken down into the molecule lactate and a hydrogen ion. That's the acid component. And the higher the intensity, the more lactic acid you're producing. So the more acidic your blood becomes. And one of the things that research has found, and this isn't necessarily, Matthew, your exact question, because we're talking now about zone 4 intensity, very high intensity, the kind of interval workout where you finish each repetition, with your hands on your knees, breathing like a freight train. But what happens when the blood becomes more acidic or the pH is reduced beyond a sort of relatively small range, our bodies are not very happy once we get very far away from pH of 6.7, I believe it is, 6.8. When you drop that pH by even 10%, which you could easily do with high acidity, it downregulates the pathway, what's called the AMPK pathway, which is the pathway that's responsible, it's a signaling pathway that's responsible for increasing mitochondrial mass in the muscle cells. So by doing this is where people have gotten into trouble with doing too much high intensity training, is that, and so I'll use an extreme example. So someone who exclusively does, 3 CrossFit workouts a week. I've tested those people. I guarantee you they will have a fairly low aerobic capacity, because doing that much high intensity that frequently just, again, downregulates this very important aerobic stimulus or stimulating pathway. So that's
So
kind of an
that's,
extreme case of
no,
this.
but just to clarify, that's like the mechanism that slows down aerobic development. And even if he's training in like mid zone 3, 140, is that enough for his pH to be different to have this cause and effect? I'm just
Probably
clarifying.
not. Whereas 160, I think it could be, you're
It
starting to
could.
produce a fair bit of lactate probably as you approach that anaerobic threshold.
Yeah.
So
So
yes, that's
then,
why I say doing this. We do most of the athletes that Maya and I work with, even the pros that we're working with, they don't do any much training around, close to their anaerobic threshold. They do some, but it's pretty rare. Most
yeah,
of their zone 3 training is done at
at the lower
just a
end.
bit over the aerobic threshold, because
So sort
that
of what Matthew's
does,
already doing.
yes, right. If
Yeah.
he's training at 140, let's say,
Sounds
as
like
a,
he does 10 to 25% of his runs in low zone 3.
oh, good. We haven't
So
gotten to that part. Yes, you're
I
right.
know.
Okay.
Well, I'm just clarifying as we kind of continue to answer
hmm
his question. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So his second question is, I wonder, because on many of my trail runs, I do 10 or 15% of my run in low zone 3 in the 130s. My average heart rate for the whole run will be 128 to 130. then you have nothing to worry about. That's not enough. That's neither high enough intensity or nor enough of high intensity to slow aerobic development. So I often tell people that, most of us are going to exceed aerobic threshold when we go out for an easy run at some point, maybe on some hills. But if it starts to become 75% of your whole workout is done in that intensity, that's probably going to require more recovery and may, in fact, reduce your training, the aerobic volume. So you may see a reduction or a slowing in building aerobic capacity. But in your case,
Yeah.
if that's what you're doing, you got nothing to worry about.
So then the next part of his question is, I cannot understand how low zone 3 could be a problem, except because of the added fatigue. I'm confused because my understanding is that racing a 5K is mostly aerobic, something like 95%. And racing a half marathon, like I'm currently doing, is an even higher percentage of aerobic output. And therefore, training in zone 3 must be helpful to aerobic development, even when I'm aerobically deficient. What am I missing? Is there a nuance that doesn't fit into neat rules? Always, Matthew. I mean, we
Yeah.
are trying to break down the human body, and it is very complex.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, you're right that these shorter running distances, even up to a marathon, or even down to a 5K, they're still the energy source, energy supply mechanism is still the aerobic metabolic pathway. Now, the longer and slower the race, the more fat is going to be used. But in a 5K, you're going to be, pretty much only burning glucose in a short race like
Mhm.
that. But
And
but the glucose better be burned aerobically, or you're going to have to slow down because as you pointed out when we were first discussing this question, Maya, you can't sustain hard anaerobic efforts for more than, a few seconds to 30
mhm,
seconds maybe. So you can't go out there and just go right to the red line immediately or over the red line into zone 4
mhm.
just because it's only a 20-minute race.
But what I would say, just to kind of clarify, running a 5K, you're going to be probably top of zone 3. If we're going to look at heart rate, because that's what we're talking
Mhm.
about, top of zone 3, low zone 4, or within zone 4, right? Where a half marathon, you might be low zone 3, upper zone 2, all of which is primarily aerobic, but it's going to be a different intensity level. And that's what you kind of have to think about. Like training for a 5K is going to be different than training for a half marathon or even a marathon. And like the time you spend in those zones is going to be different as well.
Yeah, it has been yeah, it's been said that training that for a world-class marathoner, so there's somebody who's running a marathon in an hour, male, that
A half marathon.
excuse me, a half marathon in an hour.
Like who
Sorry,
is running a marathon in
yeah,
an hour?
no,
Didn't
nobody,
know.
even Eliud Kipchoge is not quite there yet.
One day.
So a half marathon in an hour that you're at, that's often used for world-class athletes. An hour-long effort like that would be used to say, okay, that's your anaerobic threshold because you're right
Mm-hmm.
at that anaerobic threshold. Now, most of us will not have the local muscular fatigue resistance to be able to sustain that high of an output for that long. We'll end up slowing down. So we often have our folks do an anaerobic threshold test that's, depending on their level of fitness, could be as short as 20 minutes. If it's a world-class runner, it could be an hour. But whatever
Yeah.
workload, whatever speed, and whatever heart rate they can sustain for that whole hour, however long it is, we would call that the anaerobic threshold. Now, that means that much of the race that these guys are doing is, right at that top of zone 3 level. Maybe
But
on some,
remember,
yes,
I'm just going to clarify top of zone 3, but their zone 3 might only be 8 beats, where your zone 3 is 30.
35.
So
Yeah.
it's just a little bit, it's not quite apples to apples.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
But the reason that even 5K runners, even middle distance runners, 800, 1500-meter runners, they do a pretty staggering amount of long, slow distance, zone one and two
Hmm.
running, even though their event is just, in the, let's say an 800-meter runner, world class is, 1:45, a minute and 45 seconds. And yet
Yeah.
there's quite a bit of record of world class Olympic champion 800-meter runners who were hitting 100-mile weeks. Well, obviously
Yeah.
they can't do 100 miles if all that's high intensity. So they still consider the aerobic base for even an event that's less than 2 minutes to be very important. And so the longer the event, the more important that aerobic base is.
So circling back, the last part of his question is, therefore, training in zone three must be helpful to aerobic development, even when I'm aerobically deficient. If you are doing races like half marathons and 5Ks, yes, you are going to want to do some zone three training. It is very important for getting you ready for higher intensity work. If you're primarily focusing on building your aerobic base, though, that could slow down that process. Is that a,
Yeah. Yeah, I
did
think
I,
that's a very, very
okay, sum
accurate.
it
Yeah.
up
Well,
quickly?
and another thing, so when you go up to higher intensity, what is actually happening? Well, your brain is forced to recruit more muscle fiber, more motor units to propel you at these higher speeds. Your legs are going to have to produce higher forces. So that means more muscle fibers, faster twitch muscle fibers. So these are in this group of, like, it's often called the pool or the recruitable pool of motor units. So going out for a easy jog for 30 minutes, the brain's recruited pool of motor units is quite low. It's quite small because that's something, it doesn't take much power for you to jog along, at 12 or 13-minute mile pace. But then as you increase your speed, the brain is needing to increase the both the volume and the strength of those fibers, the faster twitch fibers. And so doing training in zone 3 and in zone 4 is you're recruiting some fibers that would not get recruited if you were out doing this slow jog I talked about before. So that's where the
Yeah.
benefit of aerobic development comes, is you're making those faster twitch fibers more aerobically, having a higher aerobic capacity when you train in zone 3. So you're correct, there is aerobic development. Um, but I would, like when Maya said, I think, you need to have some of this in training intensity training in your program. But if if you're just focused on, like, a winter of base building, okay, I'm just going to build base training, then doing strength and short speeds and a lot of aerobic volume is going to be more helpful than adding that zone 3. Wait till you're coming closer to race season. Then you say, okay, I'm going to have a few weeks, 6 weeks, 8 weeks or something where I'm going to have one zone 3 workout, and then it could be up at the higher end, but you will have probably really fixed your aerobic deficiency if you had 6 month block of just aerobic base training. You won't get
Oh,
faster, but you'll be
no.
able to handle the zone 3 much better.
And that is common. People sometimes come to us who have aerobic deficiency syndrome, and then we correct it and they do feel slower. But then we say, okay, now we're going to work on speed again, and you're going to handle it much better and recover much better. So it can feel counterintuitive, just as a warning.
And there is
Um,
one last question that Matthew put in there, said, if you have time for more. And since this is our last question, Matthew, I think we do have time. We can wrap this up and answer that. Um, he says, with such an aerobic deficiency, remember this is about 35 heart rate beats. Um, do I
hmm,
need more zone 1 recovery, or can I do everything in zone 2? And this is a great question, but it's very fundamental and basic. And that is, you don't need to be doing zone 1. Probably you can do all of your aerobic base training in zone 2, because it's not going to be that muscularly taxing for you because you're probably running at a relatively slow speed. Whereas if you take a world-class athlete, whereas Maya said, the difference between aerobic and anaerobic thresholds may only be 8 beats, then training at the aerobic threshold is it's going to be fast. I mean, we have
yeah.
athletes whose aerobic threshold pace is, sub 4 minutes, sub 5 minute miles. They're still at aerobic threshold. But you can
Yeah.
imagine that the mechanical work, the neuromuscular forces that are required to propel you that fast, it's going to be pretty taxing. So for them, they have to be a little more careful with zone two. Those zone two workouts can be pretty hard for them. For your
Even when they
case,
go out for
Martha,
a long distance run, they do it more so upper zone one, low zone two,
yeah,
and recovery runs definitely in zone one. Yeah.
yeah. Okay, well
I think we did it all, Scott.
I
I'm
think we
so
wrapped up
honored.
this all the stuff we couldn't get to last time, and it still took us an hour. So
Well,
um,
thanks
hopefully
for
people are enjoying this, and thank you for tuning in. Please
thanks for
keep
having
those
me.
cards and letters coming. Reach us with through direct message on Instagram or coach@evokeendurance.com with your questions, and we will provided there's enough questions to do another one of these here in May, we could do one in a couple weeks. So, but thank you everybody, and thanks Maya for helping me out today.
Thanks for having me.